The snow fell in heavy sheets, dense and merciless. It swallowed the forest whole, drowning everything in a deathly silence. A man lay buried beneath the frozen snow of the Appalachian Mountains. His mouth was sealed with black tape, his hands bound tightly behind his back, and his body was going numb second by second. No one knew where he was. No one was coming. There was no escape, no phone, no voice, no hope. But this was no ordinary victim. This was Jackson Kessler, the Reaper, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. The man who made the entire underworld tremble in fear was now dying slowly in the darkness, and not a single soul knew where to find him. Suddenly, small footprints appeared in the snow. A boy no older than 9 stumbled through the blizzard. His cheeks were raw from the cold, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Beside him ran a massive Neapolitan Mastiff, alert, focused, and determined. The boy wasn't lost. He was following his dog. Without warning, the Mastiff stopped dead in its tracks. Its ears stood straight up, trembling slightly, with a wild urgency, as if its very life depended on it. The dog began barking furiously while digging through the snow. "What's wrong, Titan?" the boy whispered, his heart pounding violently in his chest. At first, he thought the dog had gone crazy. But he was wrong. He was terribly wrong, because Titan was searching for someone. Every instinct inside the Neapolitan Mastiff was screaming that something was wrong. Then the boy heard a faint knock coming from beneath the snow. What they discovered next would change the fate of the most feared man in the criminal underworld, expose a betrayal from someone he trusted with his life, and prove something that no one could explain. What happened after that left everyone in shock. If you love stories about loyalty, courage, and unexpected heroes, smash that like button and share this video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our community so you never miss a story. God bless you all. The forest had never been this silent. Snow covered everything in thick, unbroken layers, swallowing sound the way water swallows light. Towering pines stood frozen in place, their branches bent beneath the crushing weight of ice, yet refusing to break. Even the wind seemed too afraid to move. It was the kind of silence that made ears ring, a stillness so absolute that even the most seasoned hunters would feel a flicker of unease. In the Appalachian Mountains, when winter unleashed its fury, the woods became another world entirely. There were no birds calling, no animals stirring, only a vast and dreadful emptiness stretching without end. The locals often said that when the forest fell this quiet, something wasn't right. Nature was holding its breath. And tonight, nature had every reason to do so. 6 hours earlier, in Manhattan, Reed Ashford had been sitting in his office on the top floor of the Kessler Holdings building when his phone rang. He picked up, and what he heard made his heart miss a beat. The boss's car had been found abandoned on a remote trail in West Virginia. There was no trace of the driver, no phone signal, no sign whatsoever that Jackson Kessler had left the vehicle in any ordinary way. Reed rose at once, his hand tightening around the phone until his knuckles turned white. He ordered a full-scale search immediately, but a blizzard was tearing through that region with merciless force. Helicopters couldn't take off. Vehicles crawled like turtles across roads glazed with ice. Every effort was obstructed by the brutality of nature. Reed paced the room, trying to steady the surge of anxiety rising in his chest. He told himself there was nothing to fear. This was Jackson Kessler, the Reaper, the man who made the entire underworld tremble. No one would dare lay a hand on him. Perhaps it was only car trouble. Perhaps the storm had knocked out the signal. Perhaps at this very moment Jackson was finding his way back and would call as soon as he could. But deep inside Reed, a quiet voice refused to be silenced. In 15 years at Jackson's side, he had never seen his boss out of contact for more than 2 hours. Not once. Jackson was meticulous, a man who prepared contingencies for every possible scenario. To vanish without a word, without a trace, that wasn't the Reaper Reed knew. Reed stopped by the window and looked down at the brilliant sprawl of Manhattan below. Millions of lights flickered like fallen stars scattered across the earth, yet not one of them could illuminate the place where his boss lay. He didn't know that hundreds of miles away, Jackson Kessler was buried beneath a heavy blanket of snow, counting each breath as though it might be his last. He also didn't know that the one behind everything unfolding wasn't a stranger at all. That man was sitting in the organization's conference room at that very moment, smiling in quiet satisfaction, convinced that his plan had succeeded. Not far from the forest where Jackson was slowly freezing to death, a small cabin lay hidden at the edge of the woods. The house stood about 15 minutes by car from the town of Hollow Creek, far enough to feel cut off from the outside world, yet close enough not to be completely isolated. This was where 9-year-old Wyatt Morrison lived with his grandfather Harold. The cabin was simple but warm, its pine walls releasing a gentle scent that mingled with the aroma of coffee Harold brewed every morning. Harold Morrison was a retired hunter, a quiet man with calloused hands and eyes shaped by long years of living close to the land. He wasn't good at expressing affection in words, but every action he took was steeped in love for his young grandson. 2 years earlier, Wyatt's life had been entirely different. He'd had a warm home in the suburbs, a father, and most importantly, a mother. His mother was the only person in the world who truly understood him. She knew when he needed to be held without his having to say a word. She knew when he was sad, even as he tried to hide it. She understood everything. Then cancer took her, swiftly and cruelly, so fast that Wyatt didn't even have the chance to say a proper goodbye. In her final days, she lay in a hospital bed, thin and pale, yet her eyes were still gentle when they rested on him. She held his hand and said, in a voice that was weak but unwavering, that courage isn't the absence of fear, my son. Courage is doing what's right even when you're afraid. Those were the last words she spoke to him. After she passed, Wyatt's father fell apart. He couldn't bear the grief. He couldn't bear the house filled with memories. He couldn't even bear the sight of a son whose eyes were exactly like his late wife's. One morning, Wyatt woke to find his father gone. There was no farewell, no note, only emptiness. From that day on, Wyatt learned to be silent. He learned to be strong. He learned not to cry, even though every night he missed his mother until his throat ached with it. Harold brought him to the cabin and did everything he could to fill the void his parents had left behind. And then he brought home Titan. The Neapolitan Mastiff entered Wyatt's life like a gift from his grandfather, only a few weeks after he moved into the cabin. Harold said it was to protect you, and Wyatt understood he wasn't speaking only of physical protection. Titan was enormous, weighing nearly 70 kilograms, with blue-gray fur and a deeply wrinkled face that made him look fierce as a bear. Strangers who saw him instinctively stepped back. But with Wyatt, Titan was as gentle as a giant stuffed animal. The dog slept at the foot of his bed every night, followed him everywhere, and seemed to understand every shift in his mood without a single word being spoken. For 2 years, Titan had been Wyatt's only true friend. That day, a snowstorm swept in so heavily that school was canceled. Harold needed to drive into town to refill a prescription that had run out and couldn't wait. Before leaving, he looked at Wyatt with serious eyes and told him not to go far from the cabin because the forest was dangerous when snow was falling. Wyatt nodded and promised he'd stay inside. But after Harold drove away, the cabin suddenly felt too quiet, too suffocating. Wyatt sat by the window watching the snow come down, feeling as though the walls were slowly closing in. He decided to take Titan outside for a short walk, just along the edge of the woods, just to breathe in some fresh air. But the moment they stepped outside, Titan began acting strangely. The dog kept staring toward the deeper forest, ears erect, body taut as a drawn wire. Wyatt called his name and tried to tug him back, but Titan didn't respond. Then suddenly the dog started moving toward the trees, his heavy steps deliberate and determined. Wyatt called louder, ordering him to stop. But for the first time in 2 years, Titan didn't obey. The boy stood there, torn between returning to the safety of the cabin and following his dog. The cold wind lashed his face. Snow clung to his hair, yet he couldn't let Titan go alone. At last, Wyatt drew in a deep breath and stepped after the dog into the heart of the forest, not knowing that this decision would change his life forever. Wyatt stood frozen in place, his heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from his chest. The faint knocking from beneath the snow still echoed in his ears, and Titan was digging frantically as if his own life depended on it. The dog's barking rang out through the empty forest, shattering the suffocating silence that had wrapped itself around the trees. Layer by layer, the snow was flung aside, revealing a shoulder, then a neck, then a face. Wyatt drew in a sharp breath when he saw the man buried underneath. His skin was pale as wax, his lips dark purple from the cold, and a strip of black tape was sealed tightly across his mouth. But what made Wyatt shudder wasn't the man's terrible condition, it was his eyes. Steel-gray eyes, open and fixed on him with an intensity that was almost frightening. Even buried in snow, even on the brink of freezing to death, that gaze carried a force of authority so powerful that the 9-year-old boy instinctively wanted to step back. This wasn't an ordinary man. Wyatt knew it instantly. Something inside him screamed to run as fast as he could back to the cabin and pretend he'd never seen a thing. This man could be dangerous. He could be a criminal. He could hurt him if he stayed. But then Wyatt looked closer. The man's hands were bound tightly behind his back. His mouth had been taped shut. Someone had deliberately buried him out here in the depths of the forest, in the middle of a snowstorm, where no one would ever find him. This wasn't an accident. It was attempted murder. And no matter who this man was, no matter what he'd done, no one deserved to die like this. His mother's voice rose in his mind, clear as if she were standing right beside him. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing what's right, even when you're afraid. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he bent down and carefully peeled the tape from the man's mouth. The adhesive clung to frozen skin, and Wyatt had to pull gently so he wouldn't cause more pain. When the last strip finally came free, the man sucked in a deep breath, as if it were the first one he'd taken in hours. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and weak, yet carrying a strange undertone, as though he was far more accustomed to being obeyed than to begging. "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." His body was so cold it could barely move. Wyatt could see those darkened lips shaking as he forced out each word. "What should I do?" Wyatt asked, his own voice trembling just as much. The man looked at him, and those steel-gray eyes softened, just slightly. "You can't save me alone. Go get help. Go now." "But if I leave, you'll die," Wyatt said, tears stinging at the corners of his eyes. The man glanced at Titan, who stood guard beside him, watchful and alert. "Leave the dog with me. He'll keep me warm. You go get help. Hurry." Titan seemed to understand the command. The massive Neapolitan Mastiff immediately lay down close against the man, pressing his large body in steady warmth against him. Wyatt looked at his dog, then at the man who was slowly slipping toward unconsciousness. He knew he had to decide right now. "Titan," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Stay with him. Don't leave. Do you understand?" The dog gave a low bark in response and pressed himself closer to the man. Wyatt turned and ran. He ran into the blinding white storm, running as fast as his small legs could carry him. Behind him, Jackson Kessler watched the boy's small figure disappear into the swirling snow. For the first time in 37 years of life, for the first time since becoming the Reaper, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast found his survival resting entirely in the hands of a 9-year-old child, whose name he hadn't even had the chance to ask. Wyatt ran as he'd never run before in his life. His small legs drove down into the thick snow, each step heavy as though invisible hands were trying to drag him back. The snow fell harder, the wind roared louder, and he could barely see what lay ahead. Everything was white, a blinding curtain of swirling frost that swallowed the world whole. He stumbled and fell face first into the biting cold. But he pushed himself up at once and kept going. There was no time to stop, no time to rest. The man out there was dying with every passing second, and Titan was waiting for him to return. Wyatt's legs began to go numb, as if thousands of needles were piercing his skin. His lungs burned each time he drew in the freezing air. His breath came out in white clouds that vanished almost instantly into the wind. He didn't know how far he'd run, didn't know if he was even heading in the right direction. Every tree looked the same, draped in snow, like silent ghosts watching him struggle. Then he tripped over a fallen trunk hidden beneath the drifts. Wyatt crashed down hard, his whole body slamming against the packed snow. He lay there, gasping, aching, exhausted, too cold, too tired, too afraid. He wanted to give up. He wanted to lie there, close his eyes, and wait for someone to find him. But then he saw the man's steel-gray eyes in his mind. He saw Titan lying pressed against him, loyal and patient, waiting for him to come back. If he gave up, that man would die. Titan would lie beside his body until he too froze in the snow. In that most desperate moment, Wyatt remembered his mother. He remembered her final days, lying in that hospital bed with a faint but loving smile. Her voice rose in his mind, warm and steady, as if she were whispering right beside his ear. "Courage is doing what's right even when you're afraid, my son." Tears streamed down Wyatt's face, hot against his frozen cheeks. "I can't give up," he told himself. "I can't. Mom wouldn't want me to give up." With every ounce of strength he had left, Wyatt planted his hands in the snow and pushed himself upright. His knees trembled. His legs threatened to collapse beneath him. But he stood, and he ran again, step by step, without stopping. Then he saw it. A warm yellow light flickering through the veil of white. The cabin. His grandfather's cabin. Wyatt burst into tears. Not from sorrow, but from overwhelming relief. He ran faster, even though his legs were nearly beyond feeling. On the porch, Harold stood in a hastily thrown-on coat, a flashlight clutched in his hand, his voice carrying Wyatt's name into the storm. When he saw the boy running from the direction of the forest, he froze for a split second, then rushed forward. Before he could say a word, Wyatt collapsed near the cabin door and cried out in a hoarse voice, raw from cold and exhaustion. "Grandpa, there's a man dying in the woods. You have to call someone. Hurry!" Harold stared at his grandson, stunned, trying to grasp the broken words spilling from him. Wyatt told him everything, in hurried fragments between gasping breaths. The man buried under snow, Titan staying behind to keep him warm, the desperate run for help. Harold didn't ask another question. He carried Wyatt inside, wrapped him in blankets, and immediately called Captain Frank Bellamy, head of the local rescue team. But the news wasn't good. The blizzard was too severe. Helicopters couldn't take off. Rescue vehicles would need at least 40 minutes to arrive, and that was only if the roads remained passable. Harold looked out the window, then back at his grandson. He made his decision in an instant. "We'll go first. We'll guide them in." "I'm going too," Wyatt said at once, his voice weak but unyielding. "I'm the only one who knows where he is." Harold wanted to argue. He wanted to order the boy to stay where it was safe. But when he looked into Wyatt's eyes, he saw something achingly familiar, the same unwavering determination his mother had carried. He let out a slow breath, then nodded. "All right, but you stay right beside me, not one step away." The two of them gathered blankets, flashlights, and basic medical supplies. Then grandfather and grandson stepped out into the raging storm, heading toward the forest where a man was fighting to wrestle his life back from the hands of death. While Wyatt was running through the blizzard in search of help, Jackson Kessler lay motionless beneath the base of a tree, his consciousness flickering like a candle flame about to be extinguished by the wind. His body had nearly lost all sensation, leaving only the bone-deep cold seeping into every cell. But something kept him from slipping into that final darkness. Titan lay pressed tightly against him, the massive body of the Neapolitan Mastiff like a living blanket, pouring warmth into the dying man. The dog didn't know who the man beside him was, didn't know what he'd done in his life. He only knew that a life needed saving, and he wouldn't walk away. In that hazy state between waking and oblivion, Jackson let his mind drift back through the years. 37 years of living rose before him like an old film reel, faded yet sharp enough to cut to the bone. He remembered the rundown apartment in Brooklyn, where he'd grown up amid the sound of breaking bottles and his father's shouting. The man had been a drunk, beating Jackson's mother whenever he was deep in liquor. Little Jackson would crouch in the corner, hands clamped over his ears, praying for the nightmare to end. His mother had been the only one who loved him without condition, the only one who shielded him from the blows, who held him each night and sang him to sleep. But when he was 12 years old, she died. Years of suffering had drained her strength, and her weakened body couldn't fight off illness any longer. On the day she passed, Jackson stood beside her hospital bed, watching her close her eyes for the last time, and felt his heart shatter. That was the day the boy named Jackson died, and the Reaper began to take shape. He ran away from home, survived on the streets, learned to endure with his fists and with a ruthlessness that hardened him from the inside out. The underworld welcomed him like a lost son, and he climbed its ladder of power with blood, with tears, with the broken bones of his enemies. He became the Reaper, the man who made the entire underworld tremble. Yet there was one rule he set for himself, and never broke in 25 years. Never touch women or children. Never. Because he'd once been that child. The boy no one protected. The boy forced to watch his mother beaten. The boy who lost the one person he loved most, and could do nothing to stop it. He didn't want any child to endure what he had endured. Jackson let out a bitter smile into the darkness. He'd spent a lifetime taking lives, a lifetime inspiring fear. And now the Reaper's survival depended on the kindness of a 9-year-old boy and a dog. Maybe this was karma. Maybe the universe was handing back what he'd given. Or maybe this was a final chance. Titan licked Jackson's face, pulling him back to the present. The warm, wet tongue brushed his frozen skin, reminding him he was still alive, still breathing. The dog looked at him with loyal eyes, without judgment, without fear. He didn't care who Jackson was or what he'd done. He only knew that someone needed him, and he would stay. "You're a good dog," Jackson whispered, his voice so faint it was almost nothing at all. "Don't leave me." Titan gave a soft whine in reply and pressed closer against him. The warmth from the dog's body spread slowly but steadily, like a silent promise. Jackson felt his consciousness drifting again, like a small boat carried along a dark river. He didn't know if the boy would return. He didn't know whether he'd live to see the morning light. But for the first time in many years, for the first time since his mother died, Jackson Kessler chose to trust someone. A 9-year-old child with wide brown eyes whose name he hadn't even had the chance to ask. He closed his eyes, let Titan's warmth surround him, and waited. Waited for life or death, depending on the small legs of a boy racing against time through the storm. Wyatt led the way, his small legs moving quickly through the thick snow, while Harold and the 3-member rescue team under Captain Frank Bellamy followed close behind. Night had fallen. The sky was pitch black without a single star, and the temperature continued to drop to dangerous levels. Flashlights cut through the white curtain of snow, casting weak beams of light into the vast darkness. Wyatt tried to remember the path, searching for the signs he had unknowingly left behind when he ran back to the cabin. A broken branch here, a bush trampled there, small, fragile traces in a sea of endless white. He guided them deeper into the forest, his heart pounding with dread. Every minute that passed was another minute. The man drifted closer to death. Then they reached the place. Wyatt stopped. His flashlight swept across the spot where he was certain he had found the man buried beneath the snow. But there was nothing. Only untouched white blanketing the ground. No Titan. No man. No sign that anyone had ever been there. Panic surged through him as he turned in circles, scanning the darkness. "I'm sure it was here," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm sure. Titan was here. He was here. I didn't imagine it." Captain Bellamy glanced at Harold and gave a slight shake of his head, doubt written plainly in his eyes. Perhaps the boy had imagined it. Perhaps in the storm he had become disoriented and afraid. Perhaps they were wasting precious time in the freezing night because of the words of a 9-year-old child. Harold looked at his grandson, then around at the empty snow. He knew Wyatt wasn't a child who invented stories. He knew the boy had truly seen something. But the truth stood before them in silence. There was no one there. Had they come too late? Had the man already died and been completely swallowed by the storm? "Wait!" Harold suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. Everyone froze and listened. The wind hissed through the treetops. Snow drifted softly down. And then, within that deadly stillness, they heard it. A faint sound, a low, strained whimper coming from farther to the left. "Over there," Harold said, already moving toward the sound. The rescue team followed, beams of light guiding their steps. They moved another 20 meters, pushing past a dense thicket. And then the flashlights revealed a sight that stopped them cold. Titan had dragged Jackson beneath the shelter of an ancient oak to shield him from the wind. The massive Neapolitan Mastiff lay across the man's body, using his sheer size as a living blanket to keep him warm all this time. When the lights hit him, Titan lifted his head, exhausted but alert. Yet the moment he saw Wyatt, his tail gave a weak wag. He had done his duty. He had kept the man alive long enough for help to arrive. The rescue team sprang into action. They carefully moved Titan aside and checked Jackson's condition. "He's alive," one of them said, astonishment clear in his voice. "But barely. Severe hypothermia. Pulse is very weak. We need to move now." They wrapped Jackson in thermal blankets and secured him onto a stretcher. While they worked, Wyatt knelt beside Titan and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck. "You did so good, Titan," he whispered, tears sliding down his cheeks. "You saved him." Suddenly Jackson's eyes fluttered open. The steel-gray gaze was clouded and fragile now, yet it found Wyatt as if by instinct. "You came back," Jackson murmured, his voice so hoarse it was nearly soundless. Wyatt nodded and took the man's frozen hand in his own. "I told you I would." Jackson tried to smile, a faint but genuine expression. Then his eyes closed again, and he slipped into unconsciousness. The group began making their way out of the forest under the cover of night. Wyatt walked beside the stretcher, never taking his eyes off the motionless man. Titan trotted close, occasionally nudging Jackson's hand with his nose, as if checking that he was still alive. Captain Bellamy stepped up beside Harold, his voice lowered. "Do you know who this man is?" Harold studied the man on the stretcher. He noticed the faint scar running from his temple down to his cheekbone. He noticed the expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained with snow. This was clearly no ordinary man, but that didn't matter right now. "No," Harold replied, calm and firm. "I don't know who he is, but someone tried to kill him, and my grandson saved him. That's all I need to know." The ambulance sped through the night, its siren wailing across a storm that was slowly beginning to fade. Jackson was rushed into the emergency room of Hollow Creek's local hospital in critical condition. The medical team worked through the night, racing against time to pull this man back from the edge of death. Severe hypothermia, tissue damage from freezing, a heartbeat so faint it was nearly undetectable. The attending physician shook his head as he studied the monitors. "Another 30 minutes out there," he told the nurse beside him, "and we wouldn't have saved him. This is a miracle." In the waiting room, Wyatt and Harold sat on hard plastic chairs, exhausted yet unable to sleep. Titan lay at Wyatt's feet, his head resting on the boy's shoes, his eyes occasionally lifting toward the emergency room doors, as if waiting for news. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each minute stretching into what felt like an hour. Harold looked at his grandson, the thin boy with red-rimmed eyes from lack of sleep and worry. He pulled Wyatt close and held him tight. "I'm proud of you," Harold said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "You did something very brave tonight. Your mother, if she were here, would be proud too." Wyatt didn't speak. He leaned against his grandfather's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of the only family he had left. He was too tired to cry, too anxious to sleep. He just wanted to know whether the man with the steel-gray eyes would survive. The next morning, as the first pale sunlight broke through the gray clouds, a convoy of gleaming black vehicles pulled up sharply in front of the hospital entrance. 5 luxury SUVs lined up in perfect formation. From the lead vehicle, Reed Ashford stepped out, 4 men in black suits moving in silent formation behind him. Their arrival shifted the atmosphere instantly. The local officers handling paperwork exchanged uneasy glances. Hospital staff whispered and stepped aside. Everyone could feel that these weren't ordinary visitors. Reed entered the lobby with the composure of a man accustomed to authority, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. He approached the reception desk, his voice cold and controlled. "I need to see the John Doe admitted last night from the woods." The nurse hesitated, ready to cite privacy regulations, but something in Reed's gaze made her swallow the words. Captain Bellamy, finishing paperwork nearby, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he asked, his hand brushing lightly against the firearm at his side. "I'm the one responsible for that patient," Reed replied without the slightest hesitation. "And you don't need to know more than that." Bellamy frowned, yet something in Reed's eyes made him decide not to press further. Instead, he asked, "What's your relationship to the victim?" Reed paused for a fraction of a second. "He's my boss." "And who found him?" Bellamy turned and pointed toward the waiting area where Wyatt sat with Harold and Titan, the boy over there, and the dog. Reed followed the direction of Bellamy's gesture and went still. A boy no older than 9, thin and worn with fatigue, sitting beside an elderly man and a massive dog. These were the ones who had saved Jackson Kessler, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast. Reed said nothing more. He signaled for one of his men to remain and guard Jackson's room, then stepped outside to make a call. Within an hour, Reed's team had reached the site where Jackson was found to examine the scene. The report that came back made Reed's jaw tighten. Tire tracks from 2 SUVs, boot prints from at least 4 individuals, drag marks in the snow indicating Jackson had been carried to the burial site. This was organized, not random, not an accident. Someone had carefully planned to kill Jackson Kessler. Reed returned to his vehicle, opened his laptop, and began cross-checking information. Who knew Jackson's schedule that night? Who knew he was traveling to West Virginia alone? The list was short. Reed himself, who had tried to persuade Jackson not to go alone. Jackson's personal driver, dismissed at the last minute because Jackson insisted on driving himself. And Conrad Vance, Jackson's advisor for 15 years, who had agreed far too quickly when Jackson mentioned the trip. Reed called Manhattan and ordered an immediate check on Conrad's whereabouts. The answer came within 10 minutes, and it made the blood in Reed's veins burn. Conrad Vance had disappeared shortly after Jackson lost contact. His office had been cleared out. A substantial sum from the organization's funds had been transferred, and the most confidential documents Jackson kept in his private safe were gone. Reed slammed his fist against the dashboard, his face ice cold but his eyes blazing with fury. "No," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Conrad. 15 years. 15 years at my boss's side." And he betrayed him. Reed convened the internal investigation team that very night. They met behind closed doors in a private room at a hotel near the hospital, far from prying eyes and listening ears. Piece by piece, the information was assembled, and the picture that emerged left every man in that room stunned. Conrad Vance, Jackson Kessler's advisor. For 15 years, the man Jackson had trusted like a blood brother had betrayed him. The evidence revealed that Conrad had been secretly communicating with a rival syndicate for 6 months. Encrypted calls, private meetings in distant cities, large sums of money transferred into offshore accounts. He had sold confidential information about the organization, from transportation routes to partner lists, from business strategies to security vulnerabilities. And the culmination of it all was the ambush in West Virginia. Conrad's plan had been calculated down to the smallest detail. He knew Jackson would travel alone because it was he who had suggested the trip, claiming there was a matter that required personal attention. He arranged for 4 gunmen to intercept him along the road. But what made the scheme especially chilling was the method he chose. Burial instead of bullets. No gunshot wounds meant no immediate evidence of murder. No body meant no crime scene. Jackson would simply vanish in a snowstorm. A tragic accident. A journey from which he never returned. After enough time passed, he would be declared dead, and Conrad, as the most senior advisor, would step forward as the rightful successor. It was a flawless plan. No suspicion, no pursuit, no revenge. Conrad would become the new boss with hands that appeared clean, at least on the surface. A perfect plan, until a 9-year-old boy and a Neapolitan Mastiff wandered into that forest. Reed was still processing the findings when an urgent call came through from an informant embedded within the rival network. The news made the blood in his veins turn cold. Conrad knew Jackson was alive. Word had spread through the underworld like fire across dry grass, and Conrad hadn't fled as Reed had first assumed. He was nearby, very nearby, and he was hiring a killer to finish the job at the hospital. "If the snow didn't kill Jackson," the informant whispered urgently over the phone, "a bullet will." Conrad had promised triple the usual rate to anyone who could complete the task within the next 24 hours. Reed moved immediately. He reinforced security around the hospital, stationing men at every entrance and exit. He contacted hospital administration and demanded that Jackson be transferred to a concealed room on another floor, one not listed on the official layout. He leaked false information about Jackson's location through channels he knew Conrad was monitoring, hoping to lure any assassin into a trap. Once everything was in place, Reed stood outside the glass door of Jackson's new room and looked in. His boss lay motionless on the bed, his skin still pale, the monitor emitting steady beeps in rhythm with his fragile heartbeat. An IV line ran into his arm. A ventilator supported his breathing with mechanical precision. Jackson Kessler, the man who made the entire underworld tremble, looked unnervingly vulnerable. "Boss," Reed murmured, his hand resting against the cold glass. "You have to wake up. We've got an enemy to deal with. And it's the man you once called brother." Down in the waiting area, Wyatt still sat there, refusing to go home even after Harold had urged him several times. Titan lay at his feet, his heavy head resting against the boy's leg. Wyatt didn't understand everything unfolding around him. He didn't understand why so many men dressed in black kept arriving and leaving. He didn't understand why the air inside the hospital felt so tense. But with the instinct only a child possesses, he sensed that the man he had saved was still in danger, and he didn't want to leave until he knew that man would be all right. 2 days later, Jackson Kessler opened his eyes. The harsh hospital light struck him like a blade, forcing him to close them again before slowly reopening them, allowing his vision to adjust to the world. His body ached everywhere, every muscle burning as if set aflame, and he could feel a web of tubes and wires connected to him. But he was alive. Somehow, by some miracle, he was still alive. Reed sat in the chair beside the bed, dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes from nights without sleep. The moment he saw Jackson stir, he shot to his feet. "Boss," Reed said, relief breaking through his controlled tone. "You're awake. How do you feel?" Jackson didn't answer. He looked at Reed, his gray eyes still clouded by medication and exhaustion, yet his voice, when it came, was steady despite its rasp. "The boy," he said. "The boy named Wyatt. Where is he?" Reed froze. unable to hide his surprise. In 15 years at Jackson's side, he'd never seen his boss show concern for anyone like this. Jackson Kessler was calculated, controlled, never ruled by emotion. Yet the first question he asked upon waking was about a stranger. "He's still here, boss," Reed replied, still taken aback. "He refuses to go home. Says he wants to make sure you're okay." "It's been 2 days. He and his grandfather have been sitting in the waiting room the whole time." Jackson lay silent, staring at the ceiling. He remembered the forest, the boy's face as he peeled the tape from his mouth. Those wide brown eyes, afraid yet unwavering. The small figure running into the white storm to find help. "Bring him in," Jackson said. "I want to see him." 10 minutes later, the hospital room door opened. Wyatt stepped inside, Harold directly behind him, his hand resting protectively on his grandson's shoulder. Titan followed close, claws clicking softly against the tiled floor. Harold instinctively positioned himself slightly in front of Wyatt. He knew the man in that bed was dangerous, even if he didn't yet understand how dangerous. The air in the room felt heavy. Jackson didn't look at Harold or Reed, his gaze fixed entirely on the boy standing before him. For the first time, he saw Wyatt clearly in the light. The boy was thin, with large brown eyes and tousled brown hair that looked as though it hadn't been brushed in days. His clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in a hospital chair. Dark circles shadowed his young face. Yet he stood straight, trying to appear brave even though fear lingered in his expression. Like a small warrior. And in that moment, Jackson saw himself at 9 years old. The skinny boy in Brooklyn. The child who had to be strong without anyone to protect him. The boy who learned to stand upright while the world tried to crush him. "Why didn't you run?" Jackson asked, his voice softer than usual. "You didn't know who I was." Wyatt swallowed but didn't step back. "I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice trembling slightly but steady. "But I knew you were going to die." The boy glanced at Titan, who sat beside him, tail giving a small sweep across the floor. And Titan didn't walk away. "I figured if Titan thought you were worth saving, then you were." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying the child in front of him. Then his gaze shifted to the Neapolitan Mastiff sitting calmly on the floor, loyal eyes never straying far from Wyatt. "Your dog," Jackson said slowly, "is smarter than most men I've met." Titan gave a low bark, as if accepting the compliment. Jackson looked back at Wyatt, and this time his expression softened in a way that was unmistakable. "Thank you," he said, each word deliberate and sincere. "I owe you my life." Wyatt shook his head, his young face serious in a way that was almost disarming. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what was right." What was right? Those simple words struck Jackson like a wave. He'd spent his life in a world where right and wrong meant nothing, where only power and survival mattered. He'd done things ordinary men would call unforgivable, and he'd never once regretted them. But standing before a 9-year-old boy who had saved him simply because it was right, something shifted quietly inside his chest. He smiled, and Reed, standing in the corner of the room, nearly dropped his phone in shock. It was the first genuine smile he'd seen on his boss's face in years. Not the cold smile reserved for enemies, not the calculated smile used in negotiations. Just warmth, just sincerity. The smile of a man Reed had almost forgotten existed. "What's right?" Jackson repeated softly, as if tasting the words for the first time. "Yes. What's right?" After Wyatt stepped out into the hallway to play with Titan, Jackson asked to speak with Harold alone. At his boss's quiet command, Reed left the room and closed the door behind him, leaving the two men in the stillness of the hospital room. Harold took a seat in the chair across from the bed, his gaze alert but steady. He was a retired hunter, a man who had faced down bears and wolves in deep woods, who had survived the harshest winters without flinching. A Mafia boss lying in a hospital bed wasn't enough to make him tremble, but when it came to his grandson, Harold Morrison would do whatever was necessary to protect him. "Mr. Morrison," Jackson began, his voice low and direct, "I know you understand who I am, or at least you can guess." Harold met his eyes without hesitation. "I can guess you're not an ordinary businessman," he replied calmly. "Ordinary businessmen don't travel with men in black suits, and nobody tries to bury an ordinary businessman alive." Jackson gave a small nod, appreciating the blunt honesty. "You're right," he admitted. "I'm not a good man. I've done many things in my life that decent people would call unforgivable." He paused, his gray eyes fixed on Harold's. But I have my own principles. I've never harmed women or children, not once. That's a line I haven't crossed in 25 years. Harold remained silent for a moment, weighing the words. Then he spoke, his tone firm but not hostile. My grandson saved you because he's a good child, not because he wanted anything. Don't assume we need your dirty money. I understand, Jackson replied evenly, without offense, and I respect that. But Mr. Morrison, I owe your grandson my life. In my world, that's the greatest debt a man can carry, and I intend to repay it. We don't need dirty money, Harold repeated, his voice hardening. Jackson lifted a hand slightly, asking for a moment more. Not dirty money. I have legitimate businesses, real estate, restaurants, investments. Whatever I do for Wyatt will come through lawful channels. Not a single dollar will trace back to anything else. He looked at Harold, and there was no calculation in his tone now. I want to make sure your grandson has the best future possible. A scholarship to the finest schools. Full medical coverage for you. Repairs to the cabin so you can both live more comfortably. It will all come from a legal, charitable foundation. No one will ever know the true origin. Wyatt will never know where it came from, and you have every right to refuse. Harold didn't answer at once. He turned his head toward the window. Outside in the hallway, Wyatt sat on the floor beside Titan, his small hand buried in the thick fur at the dog's neck. The boy was laughing, a clear, bright sound Harold hadn't heard often since Wyatt's mother died. He thought of their difficult life, the aging cabin that needed repairs, the growing cost of medication. Wyatt's dreams of a future Harold wasn't sure he could afford to give him. He thought about how the boy deserved more than what he alone could provide. If you ever do anything that harms my grandson, Harold said at last, turning back to meet Jackson's gaze. Anything at all, I'll find you. I may be old, but I still know how to use a rifle. Jackson didn't smile. He didn't dismiss the threat. Instead, he nodded with genuine respect. If I ever do that, he said solemnly, you have every right to find me, and I won't resist. The two men held each other's gaze in a long, quiet moment. Then Harold gave a slow nod. All right, but Wyatt can't know. He doesn't need to know where the money comes from. He doesn't need to know who you are. He just needs to grow up like a normal boy. Agreed, Jackson replied. That's what I want too. They didn't shake hands. No papers were signed. Yet in that small hospital room, two men from entirely different worlds reached an understanding. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast and a reclusive former hunter from the woods, not bound by money or power, but by mutual respect for a 9-year-old boy who had chosen to do what was right in the heart of a snowstorm. 1 week later, Jackson Kessler was strong enough to leave his hospital bed. The doctors advised him to remain a few more days for observation, but Jackson wasn't a man who knew how to sit still. He left the hospital under the escort of Reed and his security team, yet he didn't return to Manhattan right away. There was something that had to be done first, something more important than anything else. Intelligence from Jackson's network confirmed that Conrad Vance was hiding in a small town near the Mexican border. Conrad believed he'd escaped. He believed Jackson would never find him among the thousands of scattered towns lining that vast stretch of land. He thought he was clever. He thought he had won. He was terribly wrong. Jackson Kessler hadn't become the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast by allowing traitors to disappear. His network stretched across the United States, and with a single call, hundreds of eyes began searching. Conrad could hide, but he couldn't vanish. Reed led the team to Conrad's hiding place on a moonless night. It was a run-down house on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one paid attention to who came and went. Conrad was asleep when the door was kicked in. He didn't have time to resist, didn't have time to run, didn't even manage to reach the gun beneath his pillow. Within seconds, he was restrained and handcuffed, like prey that had finally stumbled into the hunter's trap. Conrad was brought before Jackson at an abandoned warehouse outside the city. He was forced to his knees, pushed down in front of the man he had betrayed. His face was drained of color, his eyes filled with fear as he looked up at Jackson standing over him. Jackson, Conrad began, his voice shaking. 15 years. We were brothers. Please, let me explain. Jackson looked down at the man who had once been his closest advisor, his gray eyes cold as ice. Brothers, he repeated, his tone devoid of emotion. Brothers don't bury each other alive in the snow and wait for news of a death. Brothers don't sell information to enemies. Brothers don't hire assassins to finish off a man still fighting for his life in a hospital bed. Conrad trembled, tears spilling down his face. I can explain, he pleaded desperately. They forced me. They threatened my family. I had no other choice. Please understand. There's always a choice, Jackson replied, his voice hard as steel. You could have come to me. You could have told me the truth. I protected you like a brother for 15 years. But you chose betrayal. That was your choice, not anyone else's. Reed stepped forward and held out a gun to Jackson. This was the moment everyone expected. In the underworld, a traitor had only one fate. It was an unspoken law known to all. Conrad closed his eyes, bracing for the final bullet. But Jackson didn't take the weapon. He looked at it in Reed's hand, then slowly shook his head. No, I won't kill him. Reed froze, disbelief written across his face. Boss? Every man in the warehouse stared at Jackson in shock. Even Conrad opened his eyes, astonishment momentarily eclipsing his fear. Death is too quick, Jackson said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. Too easy. One bullet and it's over. He wouldn't suffer at all. He looked down at Conrad, his gray gaze sharp and unwavering. I want him to live in prison, to wake up every day with regret, with humiliation, with the knowledge that he lost everything because of his own greed. Turn him over to the FBI. Include every piece of evidence of his illegal dealings, including what he did with the rival syndicate. He'll spend the last 30 years of his life behind bars, despised by both sides as a traitor. Conrad stared at Jackson, eyes wide with disbelief. You'd let them take me? He shouted, anger and panic colliding in his voice. You'd hand me to the authorities? You're not the Reaper I knew. Jackson gave a faint smile, cold but no longer cruel. Maybe I'm learning to become someone else, he said softly. Conrad was dragged away, shouting and pleading, but no one paid him any mind. By morning, he would be delivered to the FBI along with a thick file of evidence, more than enough to keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. Reed stood beside Jackson, looking at his boss with new eyes. In 15 years, he'd never seen Jackson spare a traitor. Not once. Boss, Reed said quietly, you've changed. Jackson didn't answer. He turned instead toward the window, where the night sky was slowly giving way to the first light of dawn. In his mind, he saw clearly the image of a 9-year-old boy with wide brown eyes. I just did what was right. What was right. Perhaps it was time Jackson learned how to do the same. After the incident with Conrad, Jackson returned to Manhattan, but he wasn't the same man who had left it. Something had shifted inside him, deep in a place he hadn't realized still existed. He began to change the way he ran his empire in ways no one ever imagined the Reaper would. He withdrew from the most violent operations, handed the darker divisions over to others, and focused instead on legitimate ventures such as real estate, restaurant chains, and financial investments. Meetings that once revolved around territory and retaliation now centered on profit reports and expansion plans. Reed watched these changes with growing astonishment. One night, as they sat in the top-floor office of Kessler Holdings, he finally decided to ask. Boss, Reed said carefully, I've been with you 15 years. I've never seen you like this. Sparing Conrad instead of killing him, pulling back from violence, focusing on legitimate business. What happened in that forest? Jackson didn't answer at once. He rose and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Manhattan, the city glowing brilliantly beneath him. Millions of lights shimmered like fallen stars, each one a life, a story, a dream. He had once looked down at this city as a conqueror, a man who held power over life and death. Now he looked at it with something else in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. I almost died in the snow, Reed, Jackson said at last, his voice low and distant. Alone. In the dark. So cold I couldn't feel my own body. I lay there thinking maybe this is the ending I deserve. A lifetime of killing. A lifetime of causing suffering. And in the end, dying alone under a blanket of snow with no one knowing. He turned to face Reed, and the gray in his eyes wasn't as cold as it once had been. Then a 9-year-old boy appeared, a thin kid with wide brown eyes, trembling in the storm. He didn't know who I was. Didn't know what I'd done. Didn't know how many men I'd killed, or how many lives I'd ruined. He only knew one thing, that someone was dying under the snow, and he chose to stay. Jackson paused, as if replaying the moment in his mind. He could have run, he continued. He could have pretended he saw nothing, gone home, forgotten it ever happened. No one would have blamed him. He was just a child. But he didn't. He stayed. He dug through the snow. He tore the tape from my mouth. Then he ran through that storm to get help. Because it was the right thing to do. 9 years old, and braver than most men I've met in my life. A faint smile touched his lips as he thought of Titan, the dog too. He lay against me all night, using his body heat to keep me alive. He didn't know who I was, didn't know I was the Reaper. He only knew someone needed saving, and he didn't walk away. A dog and a child taught me more than all my years in the underworld. Reed remained silent, listening. It was the first time he'd heard his boss speak so openly, and the first time he'd seen not the Reaper, but a man carrying pain, regret, and something that looked like hope. When Wyatt grows up, Jackson said softly, if one day he learns who I am, what I've done, I want to be able to look him in the eye without shame. I want to deserve the second chance he gave me. A 9-year-old boy who asked for nothing, who knew nothing about me, who simply saved me because it was right. I want to become a man worthy of that kind of faith. He turned back toward the window, the city lights reflecting in his gray eyes. Maybe it's not too late, Reed. Maybe it's not too late to change, to become someone else, to do what's right. Reed rose and stepped to stand beside him. He looked out over the city, then at Jackson. In 15 years, he'd seen this man in every circumstance, from tense negotiations to bloody confrontations. But never like this. If you believe that, Reed said firmly, then I'm with you, wherever you go. 2 weeks after the night in the forest, the small town of Hollow Creek held a ceremony in the central square. It was one of those rare, clear winter days when the sun managed to break through the gray clouds, and townspeople gathered in thick coats and scarves to witness something special. Titan, the massive Neapolitan Mastiff with the deeply wrinkled face, was awarded a medal for bravery in animal rescue. Captain Frank Bellamy stood at the small podium, his voice carrying through a modest speaker into the crisp afternoon air. That night, our rescue team couldn't reach the area because of the blizzard, Bellamy said. We had the equipment, we had the training, we had the experience. But this dog did what we couldn't. He found the victim. He didn't give up. He lay beside him all night to keep him warm. Without Titan, that man would have died. He turned toward Wyatt, who stood beside Titan looking smaller than ever amid the crowd. And without this young man, Bellamy continued, who ran through that storm to get help, none of us would have known someone was dying out there. Wyatt Morrison and Titan, you're true heroes. Applause rolled across the square. Wyatt shifted awkwardly, unaccustomed to so much attention. He'd always been quiet, more comfortable in corners than in the center of anything. Now hundreds of eyes were on him. Local reporters snapped photographs. Cameras recorded every moment. The clapping didn't seem to stop. Heat rushed to his face, and for a second he wished he could disappear. Harold stood just behind him, resting a steady hand on his grandson's shoulder. He leaned down and whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of you. Your mother would be proud too. And then something happened that no one expected. Wyatt began to cry. It was the first time he'd cried since his mother passed 2 years earlier. He'd taught himself not to cry, taught himself to swallow the tears, taught himself to be strong. But standing there in the middle of that square, wrapped in his grandfather's arm, surrounded by applause, he couldn't hold it back anymore. Tears streamed down his face, not from sadness, but from release, from knowing he'd done what his mother had taught him. He'd been brave. He'd done what was right, even though he was afraid, and she would have been proud. At the edge of the square, beneath the shade of a tree, a sleek black car sat quietly. Inside, Jackson Kessler watched through the tinted window. He hadn't come to be seen. He hadn't come to be thanked. He only wanted to make sure the boy was all right. Watching Wyatt cry in his grandfather's embrace, watching Titan stand proudly with the medal hanging against his broad chest, Jackson allowed himself a faint smile, a smile no one noticed. He signaled the driver, and the car pulled away, merging silently onto the small town road. 3 months later, spring arrived in the Appalachian Mountains. The snow melted. Streams began to run again. The forest returned to life, with bright green shoots pushing through the earth. Wyatt had changed. He was no longer the withdrawn boy who kept to himself. He spoke more. He laughed more. He'd made friends at school. The other children no longer called him the lonely kid. They called him the hero. Wyatt didn't particularly like the nickname, but he didn't argue either. What he didn't know was that an unseen hand had quietly altered the course of his and his grandfather's lives. The cabin was repaired with a new roof and a modern heating system. Harold received the best medical coverage in the region. And a mysterious scholarship foundation contacted Wyatt's school, pledging to fund his education all the way through college. Everything came through legitimate channels. No one knew who stood behind it. One spring afternoon, Wyatt sat on the porch of the cabin with Titan stretched out beside him, gazing at the forest turning green again. Harold stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate and settled into the chair beside his grandson. "Grandpa," Wyatt said after a moment, "do you think that man was good or bad?" Harold didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of chocolate, considering his words. "I don't know, Wyatt," he said at last, his voice calm and thoughtful. "The world isn't that simple. People aren't entirely good or entirely bad. They're more complicated than that." He paused and looked out at the trees. "But I do know this. What you did reminded him that even in darkness, there's still light. Even those who've lost their way can sometimes find it again. And sometimes, that's enough." Wyatt nodded, running his fingers through Titan's thick fur. "I just followed Titan," he said softly. "He found the man, not me." Harold shook his head and looked directly into his grandson's eyes. "No, Titan found him. But you chose to follow. You chose to stay when you could have run. You chose to run through that storm for help. That was you, not Titan." Wyatt looked at his grandfather, then down at the dog resting beside him. A gentle, thoughtful smile formed on his face, and slowly, he began to understand. 6 months later, summer arrived in the Appalachian Mountains in its fullest glory. The forest that had once been swallowed by snow and darkness had transformed completely. Trees stood lush and vibrant, birdsong echoed through the canopy, and golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering dancing patterns across the ground. There was no trace left of that terrifying winter night. Only life. Only hope. Wyatt and Titan walked along the familiar trail, the same path that 6 months earlier had led him to a meeting that changed his life. The boy had grown a little taller, a little sturdier, and his smile came more easily now. Titan trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back at his young master, tail wagging in wide, happy arcs. A boy and a giant dog moving through the forest as if it were their own quiet kingdom. When they returned to the cabin, Wyatt noticed a sleek black car parked out front. It was the kind of luxury vehicle rarely seen in a small town like this, and for a brief moment his heart quickened. Then the car door opened, and a man stepped out. Jackson Kessler stood there beneath the summer sun, looking nothing like the pale, fragile figure Wyatt had last seen in a hospital bed. The color had returned to his skin. His strength had returned to his frame. He stood solid and composed. Yet something in his gray eyes had changed. They were no longer cold as steel. They were calmer, lighter, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Titan recognized him instantly. The massive dog bounded forward, tail wagging furiously, letting out low sounds of joy. Jackson crouched down and embraced him, laughing softly as Titan covered his face with grateful licks. Wyatt followed, surprised but not afraid. He stopped a few steps away, wide brown eyes studying the man before him. Harold appeared in the doorway of the cabin, his posture instinctively protective, though he didn't intervene. He knew who this man was. He knew how dangerous he could be, but he also knew the man wouldn't harm his grandson. Jackson rose, then lowered himself to one knee so he was eye level with Wyatt. It was a simple gesture, yet deeply meaningful. The most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, kneeling before a 9-year-old boy. "I wanted to thank you," Jackson said, his voice low and warm. "Properly. In person. Not through someone else. Not through gifts. Me, saying it to you." "You don't have to," Wyatt began, but Jackson shook his head gently. "I do. I need to." He looked straight into the boy's eyes. "You saved my life. Not because you knew who I was. Not because you wanted something. But because it was the right thing to do. You taught me something no one ever taught me in all my years, that sometimes doing what's right doesn't need a reason." Wyatt looked down shyly, cheeks flushing. "Titan saved you," he murmured. "I just ran for help." "No," Jackson replied firmly. "Titan found me, but you chose to stay when you could have run. You chose to face the storm when you could have gone home and forgotten everything. That's real courage. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're afraid." Wyatt lifted his head, eyes shining. "That's what my mom used to say," he whispered. A soft smile touched Jackson's face. "Your mother was a wise woman." He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a small box. Opening it, he handed it to Wyatt. Inside lay a simple silver necklace with a finely carved pendant, shaped like a mastiff. "This is from me," Jackson said. "And this." He handed him a card. "If you ever need anything at all, contact this man. His name is Reed. He'll help you." Wyatt accepted the necklace and the card, not fully understanding their weight, but sensing the sincerity behind them. He slipped the necklace around his neck, the mastiff pendant resting against his chest. Jackson turned to Titan and stroked the dog's broad head. "You're the real hero," he said quietly. "Without you, I'd have died that night. Good dog. The best dog I've ever known." Titan licked his hand, tail wagging as if he understood every word. Jackson rose and stepped toward Harold at the cabin door. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "you've raised an extraordinary boy." Harold shook his head slowly. "Not me. His mother taught him how to love, how to be brave. I'm just trying to keep that alive." Jackson nodded, respect evident in his gaze. "You're doing better than you think. Much better." He turned back for one last look at Wyatt before heading toward the car. "Do you know what makes you different?" he asked. Wyatt shook his head. "You have the heart of a warrior," Jackson said gently. "Don't ever let anyone take that from you." He stepped into the car. The door closed softly, and the black vehicle rolled away down the dirt road. Wyatt stood watching, Titan sitting beside him, until the car disappeared around the bend. He lifted a hand and touched the silver necklace resting on his chest, feeling the shape of the mastiff beneath his fingers. He didn't fully understand who that man truly was, but he knew one thing: he would never forget him. After the black car disappeared beyond the bend in the road, Harold stepped up beside his grandson. He rested a hand on Wyatt's shoulder and looked down the dusty path where faint tire tracks still marked the earth. "Do you know what you did?" Harold asked gently. Wyatt tilted his head up, wide brown eyes filled with quiet curiosity. "I saved someone?" Harold shook his head, his gaze distant yet warm. "Not just that. You changed someone. And sometimes, that's even harder than saving a life." Wyatt didn't respond right away. He gave a slow nod. He didn't fully understand the weight of his grandfather's words, but he felt it settle somewhere deep inside him. He turned toward Titan, the giant dog with the wrinkled face and unwavering loyal eyes that never strayed far from him. "Let's go, Titan," Wyatt said softly, and began walking toward the forest. The two friends followed the familiar trail, the same path that 6 months earlier had led them to a life-changing encounter. Summer sunlight streamed through the green canopy, casting golden patterns that danced across the ground. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and leaves rustled gently in the breeze. Wyatt no longer feared this forest. It had become part of his story, part of who he was. As he walked, he thought of his mother. He thought of her smile, of her gentle voice, of the lesson she left him. Courage is doing what's right even when you're afraid. He had lived by those words, and somehow they had brought him here. He thought of the man with the steel-gray eyes and the unexpectedly warm smile. He thought of Titan, the loyal friend who had never once left his side. Wyatt stopped at the very place where he and Titan had found Jackson that winter night. Where there had once been a grave of snow, wildflowers now bloomed. Small white and yellow blossoms swayed softly in the summer air. There was no trace left of the blizzard, no mark of fear or danger. Only life, only beauty. Titan sat beside him, watching him with steady devotion. Wyatt knelt down and ran his hand over the dog's broad head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath his palm. "You know something, Titan?" he said quietly. "You're the real hero. You found him. You didn't leave. I just followed you." Titan gave a short bark as if agreeing, then licked Wyatt's face until the boy laughed. They sat there together in the golden light of summer, in the forest that had witnessed a small miracle. A boy and a dog had saved a life. But more than that, they had changed a man. Because sometimes courage doesn't roar. It doesn't arrive in grand victories or dramatic acts. Sometimes it whispers, "Try one more time. Take one more step. Don't give up." And sometimes, just sometimes, that quiet whisper is enough to change everything. Our story comes to its close here. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story that speaks to the soul. We'd love to ask you something. If you were in Wyatt's place, Would you have had the courage to stay? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what your heart has to say. This story reminds us that heroes often come from the most unexpected places. A child, a dog, a small act of kindness powerful enough to change a life. And no matter who you are, no matter what your past may hold, there's always a chance to change, to become a better version of yourself. We're a small channel dedicated to sharing stories of loyalty, courage, and the quiet heroes who walk among us every day. Your support means more than you know and helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life. We wish each of you watching good health, a life filled with joy, and days of peace and calm. May God bless you all. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.